So as everyone is filing in, we will get our housekeeping stuff out of the way and then move on to intros. First off, thank you everyone who's coming in tonight, and thank you to Kate and thank you to Maria for being here with us. We appreciate you coming and spending your night in front of your computers on Zoom for probably the umpteenth time this week for everybody. So we really appreciate it. Tonight's event is co-hosted with Bank Square Books, which I believe is located in, I think, Connecticut. We just love supporting other New England indies. I'm Amanda from Belmont Books. I'm the events coordinator. If you haven't attended a virtual event with us, it goes a little like this. I will introduce our authors and speakers tonight, and then they will talk for roughly 40 to 45 minutes. We will then open it up for Q&A at quarter of, and you can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom. It looks like 2 speech bubbles, or you can submit them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and so I can easily kind of collect them and yoink them out for when we're ready for Q&A. But you can pop those questions in whenever you have them. We don't have any more events this week, but we do have a picture book launch for another local author, Carrie Finnison. It's a wonderful story about 2 sisters. It's called Lulu and Zoe. The illustrator is Brittany Jackson, who did the wonderful Parker Looks Up book about a little girl seeing Michelle Obama's portrait at the National Gallery. It's very cute. So we're happy to do the picture book launch on Tuesday. And then big news, next Saturday, June 11th, Belmont Books will be celebrating their 5th anniversary. So if you're in the area, we're going to have a wonderful day of story times, and there will be free ice cream and goodie bags for kids. So if you're in Belmont and you're free next Saturday on the 11th, we have a full day of stuff planned. And we hope that you'll celebrate with us. So I'm going to introduce both Kate and Maria. Kate Bernheimer has been called one of the living masters of the fairy tale by Tin House. She is the author of the story collections, How a Mother Weaned Her Girl from Fairy Tales, and Horse, Flower, Bird, and editor of 4 anthologies, including the World Fantasy Award-winning My Mother, She Killed Me, My Father, He Ate Me, and World Fantasy Award finalist, Exo Orpheus, 50 New Myths. With Laird Hunt, she co-authored the novel Office at Night, and Andrew Bernheimer, she co-authored the design book Fairy Tale Architecture. Her books have been translated into several languages, including Chinese, Korean, Italian, Hebrew, Turkish, and Japanese, to name a few. Maria Adelmann is the author of the short story collection Girls of a Certain Age, which explores the many impossible choices of modern girl and womanhood. Her work has been published in places like Tin House, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, the Three Penny Review, the Indiana Review, and many others. She's also been selected for the Best American Short Stories as a distinguished story. How to Be Eaten is her first novel. I will turn it over to Kate and Maria, and I will be back a little later for questions.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Kate, for being here. We're going to start. We decided we'd start with me reading a little bit, and Kate is going to help me read some parts. So we have actually different editions of the book because we have an ARC and a hardcover. So hopefully they'll match up, but you'll see live in person whether or not they do. So I'm going to read from Gretel's section. And this section is interesting because I originally started the book as flash fiction, not thinking it would ever be a novel, just little teeny excerpts about how different fairy tale characters might have reacted right after or years after their fairy tale ended. So this piece was published in Tin House. You can read it online. Actually, it's called Gretel's Dreams Online to see how that it actually remained it's very unchanged to what's in the final book. So I thought that was interesting. And I'll skip ahead and read another section. For this section, Gretel is with her girlfriend Jade and is having a hard time connecting with her and telling her Jade what happened to her. And so this is about Gretel's nightmares. And Kate is going to read Jade's lines. And if you happen to have a book, you can follow along on page 194. Okay, so here we go. One night, I awoke sweating and terrified. I could still see the after image of an old woman's face, her eyes strange, too wide and rarely blinking. Jade was beside me, rubbing her jaw, her own eyes shining in the dark.
You got me.
Shit, I'm sorry. My tongue felt like sandpaper. My jaw was clenched tight as a fist. The veins running from my temples pulsed. A dentist once told me that I grind my teeth so hard I've worn down through the enamel. I'm down to the dentin. Next is the pulp, raw nerve.
No, it's okay. It wasn't that hard. Just surprised me.
She lay back down, stacked herself into me, her hair sweeping over my face. I tried not to smell her tropical shampoo. I let my fingers glide against her jaw.
You have a lot of nightmares. What are they about?
How could I answer? What could I say without giving myself away? In some dreams, I didn't tell her, I'm a piece of dark, hollow chocolate living on a grocery store shelf in an airtight box with a clear plastic front. I have giant eyes, but I can't close them. I have a mouth, but it doesn't open. I feel like I'm slowly suffocating. Some grocery store shoppers pick me up, shake me around. Others don't notice me at all. They walk by carrying sharp knives that glisten under the lemony fluorescent lights. They carry assault rifles as dark as licorice. They carry scythes slung over their shoulders, the crescent blades curved like a witch's beckoning finger. In other dreams, I struggled to stay afloat in a rich sea of butterscotch with a consistency between molasses and mud. When I thrust my hand from the muck, butterscotch pulls from my fingers in strings, like spit that drags at the corner of a mouth. On a distant shore, translucent blue and red bricks are stacked to form cabins that shimmer and wink in the orange sun. But I don't dare swim to them. I would, it turns out, rather drown. Something flicks past me, a fish, bright red and rubbery. Even in the dream, I think, what the hell is the moral of this fucking story? There's a dream in which I am reclined in a dentist chair. My mouth is open wide and a light shines on me from above. The dentist is an older woman with big eyes, a thin face, a dark mole on her chin. As she smiles, her lips curve and her teeth, sharp as candy corn, seem to rise above the line of her lips. They're all cavities, she cackles. One by one, she begins to tear out my teeth, which are square and matte like chiclets. Beneath my teeth, hiding in my gums, are strings of candy necklaces. The dentist pulls them out like gauze. I feel them drag against the raw interior of my gums. On the little steel tray beside the dentist chair, candy is piled high and bloody.
Gee, what are they about?
Outside the gray bedroom, a siren wailed like a pained animal, faded away. Car accidents, I said. Police cruelty. Zombie apocalypse.
Your nightmares sound like what someone would make up about nightmares.
She yawned in little sucked-in breaths. I guess I'm not that deep, I answered.
Oh, I don't think that's true. I wouldn't love someone basic.
My jaw contracted as if my mouth were full of sugar. In the streetlight, angling through the blinds, Jade's skin seemed to shimmer like some bright thing dropped on a dim street. But where did that get me? So that's the end of that little section, and I'll just go forward to page 2 or 3 if you happen to have a book, and just read 2 more pages. And this pages are about sort of the difference between Gretel's memories of what happened to her with the candy house and what's in the police report. And part of the problem is that Gretel and Hansel have different memories of what happened to them. And Kate is going to read these parts that are in italics that are like Gretel's internal dialogue or how she answered these questions as a kid. So here are the facts insofar as they are written in the police report. 2 children, ages 6 and 9, are discovered by a woman on her way back from picking up ramen at a corner store. The girl is severely malnourished. The boy is not. They're both dehydrated. They're both dirty. The kids seem a little spaced out. The girl twirls around on the sidewalk. The girl refuses to eat. The woman takes the children to the hospital. The girl crawls under the nurse's station, extends a pencil out to nobody. She closes her eyes, grabs the pencil with her other hand, clutching it. Too skinny, she cries in a haunting, high-pitched tone that is not how a little girl should sound. I remember the police interview, the two detectives, a woman with short brown hair and a face like a moon, a man all muscles with a pinched face and a long forehead. I remember a tiny room with a big mirror. I remember sitting in a blue chair at a high table. I remember concentrating very hard on drawing black loops with a broken crayon, terrified that I was in trouble. What are you drawing? They asked.
Scribbles, licorice.
How did you get lost?
My parents left us.
You mean you got lost?
Yeah.
What did the house look like?
Covered in candy.
You mean it was brightly colored?
Yeah, because it was made of candy.
Who was she?
An old woman,
How old?
like my grandma's age, like old as a witch.
And was she nice or was she not so nice?
Not nice. First, I could only eat candy, and then nothing at all.
But your brother could eat.
She was fattening him up.
How did you get out?
We escaped.
By the end of the interview, my paper was full of black loops, rising. Already I was learning the art of tailoring the story, adding and subtracting so I wouldn't get in trouble. My brother was somewhere in another room, telling his own version. Why didn't you call home? They asked him.
Because we wanted to stay.
Then why did you leave?
She was dead. The house smelled terrible.
My brother backtracked on only two details. The first, that the house was made of candy. The second was that the woman was dead, though he could not explain why we had left. When I read the police report many years ago, much of what I remembered about that day matched up with what was written in the report. However, the interview was not conducted by two detectives. It was conducted by one woman. I suddenly realized that my memory had overwritten her with two detectives from a famous long-running cop show. If a detail like that could shift so easily, what else might have shifted? Could I be wrong about the house?
But I remember it.
But houses aren't made of candy.
But then where the fuck were we?
And I made Kate swear. I'm sorry.
For 30 years, I've avoided swearing at a public event, and you did it. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hearing
So
that,
that's the end of that's the end of the reading portion. So go ahead.
Thank you for letting me play along and read with that. It really harkens to how you capture the form of fairy tales, like their reliance on that orality and that storytelling quality, but then also some of the history of fairy tales with the variations and the contradictions and the different recollections of what they are, and how there isn't really a true a singular version that's correct or not correct, as in trauma, which so much of your book is actually about. So thank you for having me read along with you, because I really got an extra layer of that artfulness there.
That was really fun. Yeah. And the Gretel section, I think in particular, is a lot about how you retell change stories, and playing with that, with the nature of fairy tales, was very kind of the exciting part, I think, of that section.
Yeah. Was she your first character for this book?
In the sense that when I was writing these flash fiction pieces, before I even thought of this as a novel, she was the first one I wrote that ended up in the final book. So I wrote other ones first and they didn't end up here. And I also just want to tell everyone that while I was writing these flash fiction pieces before I thought it would be a novel, I had told my uncle that I was writing these, and he sent me Kate's anthology. My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me, which I loved. And I hadn't actually, I don't know why I thought after years of generations of fairy tale retellings that contemporary fairy tale retelling would have somehow not be a thing or something I had just come up with. But it was one of the early times I saw all of these really contemporary pieces put together, and I really loved that. So I thank you for writing that, and I can't wait to go back to it again now that I finished the book, because I closed it when I started writing the novel, and I would not look at it because I didn't want to be influenced by it. But anyway, off track, but I appreciate the book, and anyone who's watching should definitely get that book if they don't have it yet, because it is wonderful.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's so sweet. That book was a lot of fun to do. And even though it wasn't all that long ago that I gathered the stories for that book, it seems like a long time ago, because I do think that, although it ebbs and flows, I do think that it's less startling to readers. Although our audience can tell us if I'm incorrect, it's less startling to readers that fairy tales might be contemporary, might still being told. Of course, they were always contemporary to someone. They were new to someone. Even the very old ones, once upon a time, were contemporary in their time. But they do have this kind of vintage and everyday futuristic feeling to them that gives them this special quality. But at the time that book was gathered, there was a little bit more reluctance to acknowledge that fairy tales might still be relevant, even as they're so ubiquitous in popular culture. There's a resistance to them in certain circles, which was depressing. And so
or like not high art, like not like couldn't be literary or something.
Yes, and I think some of that comes from, like, honestly, like an unexamined envy of how, like, gosh darn entertaining they are at the same time as they can address very grave and sacred motifs. And your book really captures also that essence, like this kind of playful, dark humor at the same time as it's gravely serious. And I was wondering a little bit about just your personal history with fairy tales, because I think that I was always writing fairy tales, but I think it wasn't until I was in my 20s and stumbled upon fairy tale scholarship by people like Jack Zipes and Maria Tatar, like heroes in the field, that I realized people were still talking about. They weren't just these books I had discovered in the library that were long ago and far away. And I wondered about your journey as a reader and writer, like what brought you from childhood reading to tackling this really challenging novel with a very clever premise at heart too.
Yeah, it's always so, I'm getting more and more interested in hearing like how how they've been introduced to fairy tales, and also the moment when you ask, like, when did you first hear a fairy tale? It's like nobody knows when they first heard a fairy tale. Like, can you imagine remembering when you first heard Hansel and Gretel? It's just there, which speaks to the nature of fairy tales. My mom's Danish, so I was super into Hans Christian Andersen growing up. I was like, really loved the Disney movies, that even the ones I would now realize are problematic in a lot of ways. I was totally all in on the Disney movies. Fairy tale theater, these like reenactments of fairy tales from maybe the 80s or something, live action. But like you, I wasn't really totally interested until I got to college. I took a children's lit class, and we had the Norton Critical Edition of Classic Fairy Tales that Maria Tatar edited. And I read the introduction which she wrote, and I was like, oh my God, there's so much more going on here than I thought. And it talked about just fairy tales in a way I had never thought about them before. And later, it must have been 3 or 4 years later when I started the flash fiction, that was why, is because I had read these critical texts about fairy tales. And I think that's the first time I really consciously realized that there was no like original fairy tale, that there were all of these versions, and that you could look at all the versions to get information about the culture they were created in. And so it just seemed like such a cool layered thing to play with. So I think it's similar, that like once I saw the critical text, I was very excited.
Yeah, I was always devouring fairy tales and I loved them. And as a writer, I was very keen on writing them. And I had a lot of people in my life, in my MFA program and elsewhere saying, you're even like an editor at the New Yorker who once sent me a letter like in my early 20s, but something like, you're very talented, but you need to lose the fairy tale stuff, because I just kept working in these fairy tale references into my stories, or things would happen that were a little bit, to me, I wasn't trying to be eccentric. It was just the way my mind worked and the stories that had influenced me. But people were really trying to bring the fairy tales out of me. And it wasn't until I encountered the scholarship that I thought, well, I can do this. I can create I can keep doing this. And it's okay if others don't understand it. I'm just going to keep doing it because I love it. But it's so affirming when you find people are paying attention, loving, careful, scholarly attention to the stories that you love, and it can really breathe new life into what you're doing as an artist. I don't know, it's very exciting. It's interesting too, like how different artists interact with fairy tales as fiction writers. Like Angela Carter famously rebelled against being called a reteller. She said that she did imitations. She found somehow the reference to retellings to be, to diminish her work, which it was probably launched as, actually. And it reminds me of how, like, the rock artist David Bowie said he wasn't a rock and roller. He just, he was an artist, and rock and roll was his art form. So he sort of imitated rock and roll in his performance. And I was wondering, as you visited this cast of characters from the stories that you weave into this book, how, as a writer, as an artist, putting your imprint on these stories, these old stories that have thousands of variations already, how did you see yourself? Did you think about it? Of course, at the desk, we don't. But did you think about retelling? Of course you did, in terms of the plot. The characters are constantly retelling their stories because it's part of the premise that they're telling each other their stories. Did you think about, how did you get from like the characters you were basing them on into, say, your own voice? Like, did you have a process that you used, like David Bowie imitating rock or something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess part of the process was when I was just writing down ideas, like maybe this could be a novel, list of fairy tale characters. I actually went back to that Norton Critical Edition and I read the introductory critical essays, and I read the like Grimm's and Pearl, if not sure how you say his name, versions of those tales, and some of the other like older versions of the tales. And I took a lot of notes and I thought a lot about it. And then I just like put it all away. I did not want to see it anymore because I didn't want to rely on it. And I sort of wanted like sort of the unconscious knowledge of all of that to bubble up as I was writing. And I think that's the really fun part of writing, is when you have all this background you can stand on, and then you just sort of let your mind do the work. And in some cases, I was trying at first relying too heavily on the old narrative. Like the Bluebeard story, I had to sort of take away from, I like little things like changing keys to passcodes and things like that are just little details, but some elements are so hugely important in the original fairy tale because they're so sparse that you feel like, can I get rid of this? So I tried to step away from the original fairy tale while still making it recognizable as that fairy tale.
I mean, I think the process that you're talking about, where you're, as Zora Neale Hurston described it, vacuuming up these stories by which the soul lives. Like, you vacuumed them up, you devoured these stories, and then you set them aside and you let them become something else. But that process by which you're substituting details that have cultural resonance for you and perhaps your reader, that's what fairy tale tellers have done for centuries, right? So they're sort of remaking the recipe and putting furnishing the stories and like dressing up their characters with things from their day-to-day lives, and from antiquity too. So like that's the tradition that you're part of, right?
Yeah, and someone suggested at some point in the process, like maybe you should make them more realistic, like could the wolf be an actual man or something like that? And I see the temptation to do that, but I think part of the fun part is that there's this magical element um, in them. And I thought part of the funny part for me was that I was like making these super contemporary retellings and in a lot of ways are super realistic. And then suddenly this magical element pops up. And yeah, I think the tradition of fairy tales having that magical element is sort of what makes them a fairy tale. So I didn't want to get rid of that either.
Yeah, and I think that the syntax and the structure by which my favorite fairy tales are written and translated often have sometimes accidental omissions, mistakes, vestiges of old stories that don't necessarily fit in with the new.
Yeah.
Commonly called anachronisms, but I think of it more as like an abstract artist technique that just is so natural to the form. It's what's really interesting about some old fairy tales is that often the most magical thing about them is simply that the characters make it out of their situation alive. Like if you think of Hansel and Gretel, which figures really prominently in How to Be Eaten, those characters are famished and have to escape a murderous woman. There's really no intervention of the supernatural per se in their story, although there's like a duck who's a helper and a candy cottage, which could just be the product of their like hallucination and hunger perhaps as well, right? But I think that magic sort of operates in How to Be Eaten in a similar way, where it's a super everyday magic. There's nothing surprising about the magic. What's really most surprising to the characters, and correct me if I'm wrong, and this might be a chance for you to share with the audience a little bit of the individual stories in it. What's almost most startling to the characters that they are surprised by over and over again and go back and forth about over and again is how no one believes them or won't believe them, or that the only reason people want to hear their story is because it's somehow sensationalistic. And that seems almost like the zone, the enchantment, like the locked box of enchantment that they're trying to like let out into the world, the secret of that or something. Does that resonate for you in any way?
Yeah, I really wanted to play with this idea that there were magical elements that like in the world we existed now. If they came out of the book, we'd be like, okay, you weren't eaten by a wolf, you know. But I also wanted to think about how we often talk about trauma, in particular women's trauma, as like, no, it didn't happen, I'm not believed or belittled. And so I wanted to really take that opportunity to sort of play on that idea, that they would have to maybe continue on without people believing them, or they don't have they have to they can't prove it to anyone. Often, like you can't prove whatever happened to you happened to you. You just have to say, I believe it and it happened. And so yeah, I did a lot of things, I think, with I try to deal with the trauma narratives in a way that played on this idea of the fairy tales, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they're in a confrontation with the fact that these stories just must need to be told again and again as a kind of testimony, a repetition of a testimony that is carried along through the generations in trauma. But I don't want to say it's funny after that sentence because that sounds a little incorrect, but it's sort of, it's so absurd that some of the details of their very existence, as with Bernice and the discoveries that she makes about her husband, about her boyfriend, the things that happen that are so outrageously violent and outrageously also, as you say, like magical, are sort of taken in stride but their testimony of what happened to them is disbelieved. It's hard not to look at the day-to-day news and just think, well, they are realism, these stories, they are realism. You can't, you don't have to exaggerate a single thing about them.
Yeah, and I wanted to, a lot of the story is talking about, of course, how the media sort of sensationalizes their story, like disbelieves them and sensationalizes
At the
it
same time.
at the same time, which is just amazing. And it's to watch how narratives get completely twisted and retold in the news under new headlines. And like in the Bluebeard story in particular, I thought a lot about, as I was writing it, some of the scholarship where basically scholars have said that the moral of that story, I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know more about the fairy tales than I do, but I think some of the scholarship said that the moral is sort of that, like, don't be curious, or maybe that moral was added to some versions of the story. And it's just insane that that would be the moral of this story, where her boyfriend is like a psychopath, or her husband in the case of the earlier version of the story. The idea that it's her curiosity that got her into trouble is so ridiculous and seems so dated. And when scholarship suggests, yeah, that makes sense as sort of the moral or lesson, it's so funny. And it's not dated at all, because we do this all the time when we're sort of like victim blaming, often women in the news. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that it seems a lot of the fairy tale stuff seems dated when we read these old fairy tales, but it translates like awfully well to the world we exist in now.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to is a huge disconnect between what is purported in a moment a story is packaged for a particular audience at a particular time by a particular author, editor, translator, or publisher, what's purported to be the meaning, the warning, the lesson, which power will always try to convey to the less powerful. What's purported to be the meaning doesn't match the contents in any way, shape, or form. Like the fairy tale itself is a wolf dressed up as a grandmother or something. You're like, this isn't that. And I think that's part, though it sort of is upsetting when we find that those so-called morals or lessons don't seem to match not either the story's artfulness nor the feeling of meaning that we get from it. So that seems sort of offensive in a way. I think that's part of their magnetic appeal, because that illogic like somehow continues to draw us to them, because we have a bit of an argument with them to make.
Right.
We aren't rewriting them and revisiting them because we're like, they got it right. It's all is well and good in the world. We're like arguing, and your characters are constantly arguing with one another in this really amazing way, I think, that is very delightful as well, like arguing about the meaning of the story or the origin of the story or the lesson of the story. And I think that's part of how fairy tales sort of accidentally draw us in, because I think like the heart of so many of them is the opposite of what we're told. Like the characters have to be curious, otherwise we wouldn't even have a story. The characters have to eat the candy cottage and get in trouble with the witch. They are supposed to disobey. Like that's the driver of the story, or all the things we're told the stories are warning us against. In fact, they are the very reason the story proliferates and is even told, right?
Yeah, that is such a good point. Is if we were just like, okay, yeah, this is Little Red Riding Hood story is perfect as it is. I have no qualms with it. I mean, a lot of my story is like an argument against these moralized versions of the story. So without me having that problem with them, I wouldn't have as much reason to write a book like this.
And I think it's part of why we enjoy reading and stories and art to begin with. It's like we, as children, we get like the sense of humor of the whole endeavor of storytelling. Like if just the joke of things being not matched up right, like a person who puts a flower pot on their head, it doesn't belong there, a child will laugh.
Right.
And you're sort of saying like, this moral doesn't fit the story. And there's something really funny and also something really disturbing about it that fairy tales and your novel, I think, really get at. So can you talk
Thank
about
you.
some of the influence, some of the stories that you revisit and shift and play with in this book for your audience, some that they may know and not know? The cast of characters, if you will.
Oh, like which stories I took and how I moved them. So a lot of people actually don't know the Bluebeard story, which I think I read in that Norton Critical Edition, someone say that there's a magic element of a key that gets covered in blood and the blood won't come off. And that without that element, it wouldn't be a fairy tale. It would just be a horror story. And so it is sort of out of the maybe what we think of as the path of a straight fairy tale, because it is this horrific story about a husband who is murdering his wife. And so that I went further with the magical elements. I was like, okay, there's not enough magic in this for me. So I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot of talking furniture in my version of that story. The Ashley character, who is a woman who wins a show that's like The Bachelor, a reality TV show, I sort of took her as our like modern day fairy tale character, who we've sort of crowned as the fairy tale character in the way we sort of use the word fairy tale today, which is like fairy tale wedding, like something with a happy ending. But of course, a lot of that has flashes of Cinderella in it, because we have made the fairy tale story into this Cinderella story. We even say that, the Cinderella story. So I didn't make her straight Cinderella. I wanted her to be like our modern version of the fairy tale character. But of course, so much of that, the story of those reality TV shows is really built on this Cinderella type story that we like to tell. So
yeah, I really like the way that you take bits and bobs of fairy tales and fairy tale characters and combine them in this sort of interesting new way, because they always do have vestiges of one another, and we blend them together when we go over stories and our memories of stories as well. So your Little Red Riding Hood, Ruby, is wearing a animal. She's wearing the wolf, essentially, right?
yeah.
But that reminded me of the story known as The Other Cinderella, which is Donkey Skin, where
Right.
the main character must wear, in that case, her beloved pet donkey as a cloak to escape the incestuous advances of her father. So you're doing a kind of hybrid retelling throughout. I mean, you're making these stories your own and using them, as all great writers do, to tell your story with your voice as you're honoring the past too. So that's really interesting.
The donkey skin story really had a strong effect on me. If anyone hasn't read that, it's wild, totally wild story. I love it. And it's
one of my all-time favorites too. Yeah,
it's so good. It's not total enough. You can't Disneyfy that one, I don't think so. So maybe that's why we don't know it as well. But there's a lot of influence. There is a human skin suit in the book, and there is like I think a history of suits that people wear in a lot of those original fairy tales. And so I did think and refer to donkey skin, actually, I think a lot. And maybe not everyone would notice that, but it's fun that
now coming to you from Disney. The girl who whose mother dies and her father grieves for what is it, a few days, and then he's like, oh, but I know someone who's an awful lot like my beloved.
It's just a wild story. And then her in the donkey skin suit is amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. So I saw so many different references woven in through the book. Was there any character? I mean, you bring these characters into conversation with one another, which is so interesting. Did you have a fairy tale character who you had to just say, like, you don't belong here, that you tried to bring in, that your audience might be interested to hear about?
I did. Well, at the very beginning, I had a lot more I'd had a Cinderella character I got rid of her, I had a Little Mermaid character, which at the end of the Hans Christian Andersen story, she becomes like the wind or the sea foam or something like that. And I was trying to work that in, and it was very confusing. And I kind of, Hans Christian Andersen is in a way his own thing because he made these original stories. They're not as spare as some of the early versions of the fairy tales that we read about. So I decided not to do that. And then the big one is I wrote an entire other like novella length piece about Sleeping Beauty. In my version, she gets rescued by this like young YouTube adventurer who's heard that she's in this castle, and she comes back into New York and she's sort of like bewildered by the world and all the lights and how do they sleep with all this light, and she's afraid of sleep because she did something wrong and everyone in the castle fell asleep for 100 years. Anyway, I took it out for a lot of reasons. One, I just needed to pare it down, and two, it did have sort of this like Enchanted feel, the movie Enchanted, where like Amy Adams comes as a princess out of the sewer grate, and it just was maybe a little too stuck in the past because she was a character from the past, and I really wanted it to be modern feeling. So sadly she had to go, but she did have a pretty fun storyline.
Are we supposed to transition now to Q&A, or are we a little bit early?
We're a little bit early. If you have
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
If you have a few last minute questions, you're welcome to ask, or we can do a Q&A, and if there's room at the end for your final questions, we can do that.
We can move on to questions if there are questions, because then that might lead me to some of my questions that I didn't get to. I'm just an over preparer, so I have literally like 10 single-space pages of notes and questions. So we would be here like Scheherazade for quite a long time if I kept going here.
Yeah, we have a few pending, but for those in the audience, if you think of some as we're doing these, feel free to keep sending them in. We have 18-ish minutes, and it's okay if we go a little over time. So feel free to keep asking. So the first question that came in was from Mary, who says, Maria, first, congratulations on your novel. I read your article on LitHub about non-traditional structures, 11 novels that thwart traditional narrative structure to brilliant effect. Can you talk about your process in figuring out how to bring these stories together into a whole rather than separate pieces of flash fiction?
I can. And first of all, Mary Hassenplug is my high school English teacher, so I'm very excited that she's here. And perhaps she can tell that one of my influences on this book is The Things They Carried, which we read in high school, which is a lot about how you tell the narrative of trauma and the narrative of your life, and how you change it and adjust it when you're telling it as a story. So that's a huge, I think, had a huge impact on me when I read it at a young age, and I've continued to think about that. So that LitHub piece is about how I had really struggled turning, both adjusting from being a short story writer to a novelist, and also having these separate flash fiction pieces, and how would I make them into a complete story. And the first time I wrote the whole book one time, and it was not working at all. So I rewrote it. And before I did that, I looked at a bunch of other literature that had interesting or different structures. And so I looked at like the Joy Luck Club, which is in some ways you could think of as a story collection, but they all are cohesive, really. And I looked at novels and fragments, and why did they stay? How did they stay together? And I just realized that when an author did it, when it worked. Like you could do anything you wanted as an author as long as it worked, which is both freeing and hard, because how do you get it to work? But they all cared for their reader in a certain way that I think maybe I wasn't doing in the first draft, which is they realize the reader has to understand what's happening and has to be taken through the story. And so I think if, as I was trying to put all these flash fiction pieces together, I wasn't taking enough care to think about what someone just coming into this cold would need. And so, yeah, all those examples really helped me kind of just see how other people did it. And the really important thing I learned was that you don't have to just write a straightforward novel, like here's the arc. You don't have to do that. You can make it however you want as long as it makes sense. So
And
if that answers the question.
especially for a multi-character novel that is in essence about trauma, that repetition and revisiting and how those characters operate like almost as a chorus, like an orchestra together over time is so important, that it's not just a linear narrative, but that what's called the repetition compulsion, but is really just the essence of getting at the truth. Like that's, just going over and over and over it and trying to get the story right is really suits this novel well, and novels based on fairy tales, I think, too. And fairy tale collections themselves can read so much like a novel because there's the repetition and the characters that are familiar but a little bit different. That transformation is kind of built in. So.
That's a really good point, is also that when you're writing in a particular form, it's really good if it matches the themes that you're trying to talk about. So it's like, you don't want to just say, I'm doing a novel in fragments, but the story has nothing to do with the fragmentary nature of whatever. You want it to match up thematically. And I like the idea of the whole book feeling a little like you pick up a collection of fairy tales and it has those different stories in it and they all speak to each other. So I think having the structure relate to the themes is important and makes a book better.
We have one that was submitted through the Q&A from Alex. I was late, so if this has already been answered, sorry. I don't think it was, Alex, though, and this is very interesting. As I hear the author speak, I'm struck by the intersection of the Hebrew scriptures stories, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and fairy tales. Are fairy tales thought to have their roots or origins in biblical stories? Any thoughts on that, Kate or Maria? We did an event a virtual event with Kat Valente and her novella Come For Me with Apples, which, Alex, if you didn't attend that one, I highly recommend watching it. I feel like that plugs directly into your question a lot. And it's a wonderful kind of spooky Stepford wife fairy tale biblical allegory novella. It's wonderful.
This is a good question that I don't really feel qualified to give an answer to, but I don't know if you have one, Kate, or not. It's fine if you don't.
Well, I mean, there are probably all kinds of scholarly answers to that questions. And I devised a way to talk about fairy tales that could be inclusive of all of those stories, like from the Old Testament that I grew up with as a young reader and listener of stories. So I don't differentiate. I devised like a whole body of scholarship just so that I could not differentiate between the stories. And what I decided to do is to look at how the stories were told. So if you think of a story that has a burning bush in it, or where there's punishment and then resolution without neurosis necessarily, I make no distinction. I look at those stories from the Old Testament through their techniques. That's just what I'm more interested in what's in common than in what's different. So I think of them as definitely, I definitely think of Old Testament stories as fairy tales for sure. Scholars might debate that. I think we have some scholars in the audience, so I don't want to put my foot in my mouth, but the very reason that I designed my whole aesthetic theory of fairy tales was almost to be able to answer questions like that with a simple yes. Those are fairy tales. We know our fairy tales sort of through the techniques and also through the profundity by which we engage with those stories, the meaning that they carry forward across generations, whether it's through trauma transformation, or joy, wherever those meanings come from, but it's through their techniques that we recognize them. So I think if you're asking a question of yourself as a reader, oh, is this maybe a fairy tale? The answer is generally going to be yes, according to at least my theories. But that's a broad strokes answer to that question.
And Kate, speaking of scholars in the audience,
I see a question from a scholar in the chat who's like the queen here.
Yeah, whose name we've already heard mentioned in you and Maria's discussion. Maria Tatar is in the audience and has a question. Wonderful to hear Kate and Maria in conversation. Maria, can you say more about narrative therapy and how there may be a dark side to telling or sharing your story? I love the critique of the media in your book.
Okay, now I'm just totally fangirling out. I have two fairy tale experts in this room with me. So
love events like these. This is wonderful.
Don't want to mess up the answer to this question. Yeah, so I wanted to explore a lot of dark sides to telling one story, and in some ways, just in terms of like the narrative we tell about trauma and trauma therapy, it's that you tell your story and then you get catharsis, or you feel better, you learn something about yourself. And I wanted to explore the dangers of that in some parts of the story. So one, like with the furniture keeps retelling the story of what happened to them, and the furniture is dead women. If you haven't read the book yet, they keep retelling the story of what happened to them, and they don't improve. They're just as hysterical about it each time. And if the story doesn't change for them, then they're not going to feel better. So just telling a story over doesn't change anything. And the other is that I think we like co-opt and commodify women's trauma and women's stories all the time. And the overarching narrative that I don't want to give away too much about, but is about how we look to hear stories of women's trauma, and we're kind of thirsty for it. And that's sort of a bad impulse I think we have as a society. So
it's so hard right now this week with I mean, what you just said is so hard not to think of the Depp Heard trial and the sensationalism of it, and how that harrowing experience that she had, that she already won, nearly a dozen cases on in the UK, not a dozen cases, but how that story is being played out as if it's like, someone else's entertainment. It's so complicated with fairy tales because they do entertain, but they are, they have very sacred and serious content to convey and carry forward and truths to share. So what you're saying, it's hard not to think of how things are played out in the media, like as if it's.
And how your story can be used against you.
Exactly.
And like in the case of Gretel's story, she says she's retold it to the media and to therapists and to the police. And she's changed it so many times because none of those people believed her, or because they twisted it. And maybe that's part of the reason why now she doesn't really know what the correct version is, because she's had to change it to get her audience to believe her. So yeah, the media messes with you that way. And I think when I wrote this book, I became, kind of complicit in turning women's trauma into entertainment, because that is in a way what the book is. And so I think me being complicit in it and the reader being complicit in it is sort of an interesting thing to think about as you're reading the book.
The fact that you're thinking about it is very important. and is why this book is readable and does not harm the reader when they're reading it. I think when it comes to sometimes retelling of one's trauma, it can be done very casually and poorly to have your story told, elicited from you. And there are a lot of people practicing so-called trauma therapy who aren't cognizant of the risk of re-traumatizing. And, it's that whole saying, your story when you want to tell it. I think the risk of retelling one's trauma is not only the cultural abuse of it for sensationalism, but also that relationship one has in one's interior life to one's story, for which sometimes there are not words or words that we would wish to be spoken. And that's part of why we go to fiction and to other art forms to experience a release and transformation. I think it's so delicate, isn't it?
Yeah.
We don't have any more pending questions, but I wonder, Kate, if you have one or two that you really wanted to ask that we didn't get to, just in case.
Well, congratulations on your novel, Maria. And I just wanted to thank everyone and Amanda for being here today and doing this and sharing these stories. And I know your novel is just out and it's your debut novel, so I don't want to distract you, but one of the best things somebody ever told me as a writer was, as soon as you finish a book, you've got to start another, because as soon as it's out in the world, it's no longer yours. Your relationship with it is forever altered, at least, and it can be kind of overwhelming. And so I was wondering, just what's next? You don't have to tell us what you're working on next, but I know that you're headed to the land of fairy tales, Denmark, home to one of my favorite authors and statues dedicated to his work, Hans Christian Andersen. Do you know what's next for you and what you'll be doing with storytelling? And maybe, are you going to continue down the fairy tale path as a writer, do you think?
Well, I hope to bring more magical elements into my short stories in particular, because my short story collection was a lot of realistic stories. There's some magical elements started to creep in, but I just started a novel that has no magical elements yet. And it's very realistic, but it actually covers a lot of the same themes as this book does. I don't know where I'm going with it, but I'm also going to be in Denmark another year, so I'm really focused on finishing learning Danish, reading Hans Christian Andersen in the original, and so who knows, once I do that, what other ideas I might get involved in.
I mean, The Little Mermaid didn't make it into How to Be Eaten, so maybe she has a role to play in your new book.
Right.
Even if it's not a retelling or a fairy tale novel, maybe there's a character who just is interested in her or something. You never know how these vestiges will crop up on the fairy tale path. So
Yeah.
and
We
you can
did
visit her
have-
statue in Denmark too. So
We did have one more question come in, which happy to take from Talia. I'd love to hear how you framed your creative practice when you wrote your characters' recollection of fantastical things, while also holding space for how they relate to trauma recollections. Did you commit to the reality of the fairy tale aspects when you wrote those parts, or did you always imagine them as somewhat metaphorical?
I think I committed to the fairy tale aspects when I wrote it. That for them it's true. I believe it's true. Some things they left open-ended, like, does Bernice really hear the furniture speaking? Like, we don't know. It's true for her, and so how is she going to deal with that? But with the wolf, I wanted the Ruby character, who's Little Red Riding Hood, to have sort of no question in her head about what happened. She knows it's a wolf. I wrote it as a wolf, and whatever other people think, she's kind of like, whatever. And so I wanted to stick sort of to that story kind of when I was writing it.
Well, that was our last question. Thank you both, Kate and Maria. Maria, congratulations on your novel. Kate, thank you for being here. I'm sure this was a blast to a lot of fairy tale fans in the audience. As a reminder, you can buy copies of Maria's book from us, Belmont Books, or from Bank Square Books in Connecticut. I believe both stores have signed copies. We both ship throughout the US. And I believe we're both open for browsing. So if you're in the area and feel comfortable being in store, we would love to have you, love to see you. And if you missed any of this fascinating discussion, I believe we recorded it. It will probably go up on our YouTube channel within 2 to 3 days is usually the turnaround. But thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you again to Kate and Maria.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
so
us.
much.
And have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.